So Aperture, the more you know, the better you'll be. The less you pay attention, the more lost and wandering you are. Let's clarify some terminology before we go forward, because I'm going to be saying sharp and out of focus or depth of field quite a bit. What is sharp and what is in focus? Sharp and in focus is what I am right now. I'm sharp and I'm in focus. I'm clear, discernible. But Jeremiah is kind of soft and out of focus. But if we change the focus back to Jeremiah, now I become soft and undiscernible, and Jeremiah becomes sharp, clear, and discernible. That's what focus is. The person or the place or the thing in your image that is sharp, clear, and discernible. We bring the focus back to me, and that's where it's sharp, clear, and discernible. Now, depth of field is the amount of that sharp, clear, and discernible area in the image. It can be really small, just my face like right now, or it can be really deep as we go to an aperture that allows for a deep depth of field. So a larger area that is sharp, discernible, and clear. Your aperture is a member of the exposure triangle. It's a diaphragm that resides in your lens. That diaphragm gets larger or smaller depending on the aperture you choose. A small aperture like 2.8 allows a lot of light to pass through, whereas a large aperture like f16 lets a small amount of light to pass through. If the shutter is a door, the aperture is a window, and you get to choose how much light passes through that window. So let's take a look at the decisions you make about aperture and how they affect the image. Number one is the aperture that you use. That creates or diminishes depth of field. We're going to take a look at that. Number two is how close you are to your subject. As you get closer to your subject, the depth of field becomes less. As you get further away from your subject, the depth of field becomes more. So that's number two, how close you are to your subject. And number three is what lens you use. Whether it's a wide angle or a telephoto, that's going to make a big difference on depth of field. So let's take a look at all three of these. On this first test, we're going to take a 45mm lens, so basically what your eye sees, and we're just simply going to frame up our talent, and we're going to just focus on him, and then we're just going to shoot through the apertures. So at wide open, at like a 1.8 or a 2.0, there's not going to be very much depth of field, but you'll see the depth of field grow. It'll slightly come forward and it'll go back a little more, about a third forward, 2/3 back. As we increase the depth of field until we get to f16, most everything should be in focus from foreground to background at f16. Now we do have the wind blowing here just a little bit, which means you're going to see the flags waving just a little bit in the background. So that sometimes may fool us and think that our flag is actually out of focus when it's actually motion blur. But that's another issue. Every one of these exposures is a correct exposure. It's called equivalent exposure. We're going to talk more about that in our third lesson. Now for the second principle of aperture as it relates to depth of field. In the first example, we shot all of our stuff with a 45mm lens, but now I'm going to pick up my lens and I'm going to move in. I'm going to cut the distance almost in half to get to my talent. And when I do that, as I get closer to him, now I'm going to shoot through the apertures again, and you'll be able to see that like at f16, it might still have everything in focus, may not quite be in focus as I moved in closer as before, but certainly at 2.8 you're going to see a much shallower depth of field as I moved in closer than when I was back further. The closer you get to the subject, the shallower the depth of field. That's the principle. As we get close to a subject, the depth of field becomes much shallower, much narrower. So if I just keep moving closer, look at the background behind me. As I move closer, look at the background behind me. As I move closer, things fall out of focus much faster. The closer you get to the camera, the shallower the depth of field and everything falls out of focus behind you. If I get super close, everything's going to fall way out of focus behind me. So the principle is that you cut your distance, and in cutting your distance, it's going to make your backgrounds fall more out of focus, which is going to give you a much more interesting subject matter because it's going to isolate them with that shallow depth of field. So the closer you get to your subject, the shallower the depth of field. The further you get away from your subject, the greater the depth of field. The closer you get to the subject, a shallower depth of field. The third principle of depth of field is lens choice. A 45mm lens is going to have more depth of field than a 90mm lens if you keep the person the same size in the frame. If I go to a 200mm lens and I keep the person the same size in the frame, that 200mm lens is going to have far less depth of field than the 45mm lens did. So longer lenses, keeping the person the same size in the frame, give you less depth of field. That's why everyone loves a 70 to 200mm lens, because it makes everything fall so beautifully out of focus in the background. Everything falls out of focus because you have such shallow depth of field when you get up that 200mm. Let's talk about application for aperture. When you have a shallow depth of field, it's really a great look to be able to shoot portraits and individual shots of people, because what happens is that isolates them from the background, because the background falls way out of focus and it just gives them a beautiful place to live. It's not so busy, so it's a great application. But if I'm shooting like a family or a portrait, I'm going to go more like the f8 because I want more depth of field. It's hard to keep the small children in the foreground and the back row in focus at 2.8. It's not going to happen. On a really tight shot, if I'm taking a picture of someone, it's beautiful on a full frame sensor to have a really shallow depth of field, but you'll just get an eye in focus at 1.4. Whereas if you really want to get an eye back into the face a little bit, you're going to have to go to 2.8, maybe even f4. So you have to think about the depth of field. How do you want to use it to be able to isolate your subject, to be able to make sure you include your subject, or in some ways to include like a scenic. If I've got rocks in the foreground, very close to me, and I've got deep background, I'm going to want a deeper depth of field. So I'm going to go to f11 so I can keep the rocks in the foreground and all the way to the horizon line in the background. So you're using depth of field as a way to communicate what you want to communicate in your image. Don't just grab an exposure, make a calculated decision. The next step in this process is equivalent exposure. How do you take these two things, shutter and aperture, mix them together, and get what you want? Shallow depth of field with motion, deep depth of field with motion, shallow depth of field with frozen motion, deep depth of field with frozen motion. In the next episode, we'll take a look at equivalent exposure and how that relates to mixing these two together, shutter and aperture. So you keep those cameras rolling and keep on clicking. And still rolling. The only water on it is what came off my hands just now. The SKB case survived the center block of the pool test.